Now that we worked on the starting page and the community page and improved the header, it's finally time to work on that meals page. And it's time to output some meals there before we then thereafter will make sure that users can also share meals. Now for that, it's this page.js file in the meals folder on which will work. And there I want to output a bunch of meals. A bunch of meals which we'll soon store in a database. But before we'll do that, let's set up the base markup of this page. The base structure of this page, you could say. And here I again want to have a header section and then below that the main section of this page. I also again prepared some styles and therefore attached you find another page.module CSS file. The page.module CSS file for this meals page. And we can and should then import this page.module CSS file, again using this special CSS modules import syntax so that we can access the CSS classes set up in that file. Because there, for example, should be a class added to this header. The header class, like this. I also want to add a class to the main section, and that is the main class that's added here. Now inside of that header, I then want to have an h1 element where I say delicious meals created and then a span by you. And I'm using that span for some extra styling because to that span I want to assign a class, to be precise, the highlight class, like this. Below this h1 element, we can then add a paragraph which simply outputs some dummy text like choose your favorite recipe and cook it yourself. It is easy and fun. You can of course output whatever you want. Now below that paragraph, I want to have yet another paragraph which should receive a class name of CTA for call to action, because in there I then want to have a link using the next link component, which therefore of course also is imported as it always is. And I'm using that link component to link to that share page. So to /meals/share, which will be the page that can be used by users later to share their own meals with the community. And therefore I'll say share your favorite recipe. So that's now this header area of this meals page. And we could of course put that into a separate component. If you wanted to, you could do that. You just have to make sure that you bring along the necessary styles. But here I'll keep it all in one component. I will add a separate component for outputting the meals though. And therefore for that, back in my root components folder, I'll add a meals subfolder to store any meal related components. And there I'll add a meals-grid.js file. Now the job of this meals-grid.js file will be to output a bunch of meal items in a grid. So therefore, of course, we start by exporting a component function. I'll name it meals-grid. And I expect to get the meals that should be output here as a prop. And then I'll output an unordered list, and in that list I'll map through all meals so that for every meal we can output a list item. Now every list item here needs a key, and the key can be meal.id because every meal will have an ID. And then inside of that list item, I want to output the meal item details. Now before we work on that, I also prepared a CSS file, mealsgrid.module, which you find attached, which you should then import into this mealsgrid.js file, just as we always did it with all those .module CSS files, so that we can add a class here to that unordered list. a class called meals, like this. And now I'll add another component here, the meal_item.js file. And I prepared a meal_item.module CSS file, which is also attached. And attached you also find my finished meal_item.js file, which is a relatively straightforward component that simply accepts a bunch of props and then outputs those props in a structured way. Now, what's interesting about this component is, for one, that it then has a link that takes us to a specific meal detail page. And here the path is constructed dynamically with a dynamically injected segment that will be different for every meal because we have that dynamic meal details page. Here, this page, which expects a dynamic value for that path segment, so that we can visit that details page for different meals. And in the end here, where I'm constructing this path, it's this dynamic slug, which will be different for every meal, that will be used as a concrete value for this placeholder. So that's one interesting thing in this component, that will have this dynamic link that will lead us to different meal detail pages. The other interesting thing is this image component. It's this next image component, and it's interesting here because the images I'm outputting here will now not be imported manually from that assets folder. Instead, we'll be working with meals that are stored in a database, and their images are stored in the public folder. Now, it turns out that these are the same images as in the assets folder, but that's just a coincidence here. Later, users will be able to upload their own images and share their own meals, and that's something we have to keep in mind when using this image component, because this image component needs to know the underlying width and height of the image that's being output. So not the width and height you want to have on the screen, but the width and height of the image you're trying to render. And it's able to detect that automatically when you're using the image component, as we did it in the header, on an image that's imported from the local file system, as we're doing it here with the logo. In that case, Next.js is able to look up the width and height. But for those meal items, we'll load them dynamically from a database, and then in the database we'll have a path pointing to some image. And Next.js will not be able to resolve the width and height of such an image, of such a dynamically loaded and resolved image, simply because the information is not available at build time, as it's the case for all imported images, but only at runtime. And that's why I added this special fill prop here. An alternative would have been to explicitly set the width and height of the images that will be output here, but the problem is that I don't know that in advance, because we'll also be dealing with images shared by the user. And in such scenarios, fill is an alternative. This then tells Next.js that it should simply fill the available space with that image, as defined by its parent component. And I set up appropriate CSS styles that make sure that this will look good. And I'm mentioning this here because it is, of course, a common scenario that you're displaying images where you might not know their dimensions in advance. And in such cases, fill is a great alternative to explicitly setting a width or height, which you should do though if you know the width and height in advance. So that's therefore this meal item component added, and with that added, we can output it here in the meals grid component. So here, between those li tags, I'll output the meal item like this, and I'll simply forward all those meal properties from that meal we have here to that meal item. So I use this syntax to pull out all the properties of that meal object and spread them as key value pairs, so as props in the end, onto this meal item. And since the meal I get here, since the meals I'll have in this meals array eventually will have all those properties that are expected as props here, this approach will work just fine. Now, of course, at the moment we have no data source yet, so at the moment we won't see anything on the screen. Nonetheless, we can already take this meals grid component here and go to this page.js file in the meals folder and output it here. But at the moment, I'll set meals to an empty array because, as mentioned, we have no meals yet. So if we save that and we go to that browse meals page, we see our header, which allows us to go to that share meal page, but we see no meals yet. But that's what we'll add next.